All right, welcome back, everyone. Buckle up. This is going to be a long one. So we are finally now in what my students would call the good part of the course. And what they would mean by that is that we're in the part of the course where we're now dealing with literature. We're looking at literature as we, as moderns living in the 21st century, understand literature. We're going to have poems, yes, like we had poems earlier, but now we're going to have short stories. We're going to have novels. We're going to have drama. We're going to have texts that look a lot more like literature to our eyes, in which, quite frankly, to 21st century tastes, are a lot more interesting. The historical preface of the Enlightenment and of Puritanism is absolutely necessary, as we're going to see. You cannot understand Emerson without those things, and if you don't understand Emerson, you can't understand basically all of American literature up to about 1945. And so those are necessary preludes to what we need to do for the context of this American Literature Survey course. But now we're into some of the more fun stuff. So now we get plot, we get characterization, we get some of the more fun things to talk about. Now, there's still a weight of historical analysis to be done. And what you're going to see in this particular lecture is that new historicist method that we've been using for all of the text so far is really going to pay dividends with a text like The Devil and Tom Walker, which is what we're going to look at today. We're going to do a biographical overview of Washington Irving. This is going to be the first video in the series, in the playlist on Washington Irving. With all those first videos of each of the major authors, we're always going to cover their biography. So we'll talk a little bit about his biography. Later videos in the series, we'll look at other short stories of Washington Irving. We may also look at some of the biographies as well. But in this video, we're going to do the biography. We're going to take a look at The Devil and Tom Walker. And what you're going to find is the analysis here goes really deep. I have synthesized a wide variety of scholarly sources. I've done some, I would say, my own original research. I have brought a lot of different things together here, and I've come up with an interpretation of the text that I really think is quite unique, both in its framework, approaching American literature from this new historicist lens, which is what we've been doing throughout this entire survey course, but also goes a lot deeper than anything else we have currently on YouTube. And this goes to one of the general philosophies of what I'm trying to do with this particular course, is to go a lot deeper. What I've noticed is that if you Google American literature in YouTube and analysis, this is a topic that a lot of people are Googling, and there doesn't seem to be much of anything. The views on these videos are pretty high, but the analysis that is provided, or rather the analyses that are provided in the videos that you'll find if you Google, for example, The Devil and Tom Walker analysis, they're all super low-level summaries of the text. Here's what's going on, and it's sort of a formal level and like a very basic way. Here's what this word means, and it's not going anywhere deep enough. And so what I want to offer you guys is a truly collegiate look at this text and try to understand, okay, what discourses is this playing into? What is Washington Irving trying to convey with this text? And how is it situating itself, both reacting against and also constructing American history, which is what we're going to see here. So with no further ado, we are going to get into it now with some of the biography. So as I mentioned, we got Washington Irving here. He's born April 3rd, 1783 in New York City. And this is important. New York City, New York State are going to be recurring themes in the work of Washington Irving. And now, as I mentioned, he's part of, and really we could say the founder of what we call the Knickerbocker School of American Literature. I have videos on that. If you're watching this in the playlist, you've probably already seen those. If not, go take a look. I have videos on what we mean by the Knickerbocker School. But basically, this is the first school of American literature that situates itself outside of Boston, outside of New England. We are looking at a literary context which is telluric. And when I say telluric, I mean related to the earth, related to the interior of the country, related to the lived experience of people who do not live on the coasts, the lived experience of people who are not merchants, right? There's a certain divide in letters and in philosophy and in cultures between cultures which situate themselves on the ocean and which thereby are related to maritime life, related to trade. They have a certain proteic nature. They're constantly changing. They're constantly in flux. And they're not dependent upon nature the same way. In the sense that if you live on the ocean, you are not dependent upon the seasons. You're not dependent upon natural cycles the same way that someone who lives in the interior of a country is. And so generally speaking, we could say the more liberal cultures, we could think of England as a great example of this, tend to be coastal, tend to be related to maritime commerce, whereas the more conservative cultures, we could think of, for example, in this instance, Iran, Russia, China as sort of archetypal examples, the Roman Empire versus the Phoenician Empire. They are telluric. They are related to the land. They are related to agriculture. And so Washington Irving represents what I would say is the first major telluric force in American literature. And when we look at this in context, that should not be a surprise. What we're getting after the revolution is, okay, Jeffersonian democracy, these radical Enlightenment principles brought the revolution into play. Everyone recognizes Thomas Paine is the man who gives us the success of the American Revolution. It takes that level of radicalism to fight the crown because it was just taken as for granted. It was just taken as an epistemic prior that, of course, we're going to accept the monarchy. Why would we fight against the monarchy? Kings are natural. Well, you're going to need a really strong force to pull that out of people. And so, of course, Thomas Paine and the radical Jeffersonian Democrats are that force. But the internationalism of the Jeffersonian Democrats, as well as their radicalism in the support of the French Revolution, starts to be counterproductive because what the Federalists recognize, and Washington Irving is from a major Federalist family, is no. Now that we are a nation state, like all that radical enlightened stuff was good to start with. But now we have to walk back the revolution. I always give my students the example. People think I'm crazy when I say this, but I really do think there are a ton of analogies between the American Revolution, so-called, and the Russian Revolution, so-called. The early days of the Russian Revolution under Lenin was just this sort of explosion of excess, of we can do anything we want, there are no gods, there are no masters, we can now enact all these major social changes, this, that, the other, divorce, abortion, we can do all these things that we couldn't do under the conservative czarist regime. And Stalin has to walk all of that back. Stalin is kind of like, oh my goodness, no, we need nationalism, we need a strong state, we need conservative social values. And so Stalin walks back a lot of the revolution in order to stabilize the revolution. And what I would say what the Federalists do, your Hamiltons, your Adams, they basically look at the scene and go, okay, Jeffersonian democracy and the radical revolutionary energy of Jeffersonian internationalism got us to where we are. That's awesome. But if America is going to be a successful state, we have to kind of undo all of that thinking and walk back the revolution a little bit. And so that's federalism. And so no surprise here, the Knickerbocker School, which is intimately tied with what is America, what separates us from the English, if it's not language, if it's not culture, what makes us different? Well, those concerns are concerned intimately with nationalism and creating a strong American culture and a strong American state. And so it's no surprise that we start to see the shift away from Boston, its revolutionary energy, its sort of maritime commerce, free trade internationalist focus, and we move more towards the countryside in the literary scene where we go, no. What we need is something rooted. What we need is something telluric. What we need is this strong national culture that Washington Irving is more than happy to supply. Now, does he think about it consciously that way? No. But I think if you do really believe, like you could look at Carl Schmitt and his theory, which is developed by later geopolitical thinkers as well, and actually goes back earlier than Schmitt. If you look at the eternal conflict between land power and sea power, the conflict as he frames it between behemoth, land power, sea power, Leviathan, that conflict is going to play itself out unconsciously in any number of geopolitical conflicts, but also cultural conflicts. And so I would say the conflict between the interior of America and the coastal cities is something that we see play itself out in the early 19th century, in the conflict between the Federalists, who are more telluric, and the Jeffersonian Democrats, who, in spite of anything, are really big followers of an internationalist Whig philosophy. It may seem contradictory because you go, the Jeffersonian Democrats, Republic of Small Farmers, this, that, the other. But we'll get into that a little bit later. I have a slide later in this lecture on the genealogy of American political thought because that is going to be extremely relevant to understanding what is going on in The Devil and Tom Walker. Good. Okay, so he's raised in Manhattan to a merchant family. They're all Federalists. He's named, obviously you can figure this out, Washington Irving. He's named after George Washington, who actually visits him in New York, and this is in 1789, and blesses him. He gives him his blessing, and so there's the famous meeting between Washington Irving and his namesake, George Washington. And as you're going to see, Washington Irving's last major work is a 5-volume biography of George Washington. It's where we get all these, the stories, the cherry tree, I cannot tell a lie, like all those sort of apocryphal stories about George Washington come from that biography. It was read by generations of American school children. It was like the major patriotic text, which again, going back to Knickerbocker School and what we talked about the aesthetic movement, what is the Knickerbocker School concerned with? National heroes, folklore, creating a strong national identity. Well, Washington Irving, in his various biographical works, one of which is the 5-volume biography of George Washington, is going to do that. And so this link between him and Washington, the national founder of the polity and the national founder of the culture, is quite interesting. Washington Irving and George Washington. In any case, he sort of cuts his teeth in the literary scene in 1807 with this satirical magazine that he runs with his brother called Salmagundi. I've been told Salmagundi is a type of spicy hash. Not the kind that is smoked, but like a meat and potato dish. And so they named their magazine Salmagundi. It's a satirical magazine, satire, as I've mentioned before, big feature of the Knickerbocker School, and it's in the style of Mad Magazine. And we get a lot of interesting things that come out of that magazine, even though I believe it only lasts for 2 years. One of which is the name for New York City, Gotham, which is actually from the Anglo-Saxon Gotham, right? Got, the word for goat, and ham, the word for like village or town. It's where we get Hamlet. Not Hamlet the play, but like Hamlet, the term for a small town. So Gotham, the goat town, is New York, and that's where we get Gotham. And that's, of course, where Batman Gotham comes from. Cool. In any case, 1809, we get his first major history, his first major literary work, A History of New York, written by this fake historian called Diedrich Knickerbocker. Washington Irving may have the first like viral literary marketing campaign. He posted all these flyers saying, has anyone seen this Dutch historian by the name of Diedrich Knickerbocker? And then later claimed to have found Diedrich Knickerbocker's papers, which was the history of New York. And this became really famous. Everyone's, oh, Diedrich Knickerbocker, Diedrich Knickerbocker, Diedrich Knickerbocker. Eventually, people figure out it's Washington Irving, but it was sort of an early viral campaign where he uses this sort of pseudonym and this character that he invents, Diedrich Knickerbocker, in a way that is really provocative and interesting. And Diedrich Knickerbocker is going to come up again later in some of the short stories that Washington Irving writes. And Diedrich Knickerbocker as a character becomes so influential that, of course, the entire literary school that has its intellectual debt to Washington Irving becomes known as the Knickerbocker School. It's also where we get the New York Knicks, right? There are tons of things in the Americas named after Knickerbocker. I'm pretty sure every city in America has like a Knickerbocker Avenue. There was an apartment complex in a place close to where I grew up called the Knickerbocker. Anyway, 1815, after the War of 1812, his family is basically bankrupt. He has to, and he's also sick at this point. Everybody's worried about tuberculosis. Family's bankrupt. They still have some money, but like the merchant business is kind of kaput. And so they send him to Europe to make contacts and hopefully get a job, but also just to go on the grand tour. He loves being in Europe, and he eventually gets a contract working as a diplomat for Spain and spends a lot of time in Spain, particularly at the Alhambra, which we'll talk about in a minute. But actually, before that, I should mention his wife, well, not wife, his, fiance, Matilda Hoffman. So he is engaged to a young woman, I believe 17, by the name of Matilda Hoffman. And Matilda Hoffman gets sick. She dies very young in 1809 at the age of 17. And Washington spends the rest of his life, or I should say Irving, I should not call him by his first name. Irving spends the rest of his life in mourning for her. He never remarries. And this is sort of a way of mourning the love of his life. But it's also, too, for him, it's like he enjoyed life as a bachelor. And this is going to become relevant because Herman Melville always looked to Washington Irving as a model for what he wanted to be and also a model of the life he wanted to live. Herman Melville, if you know anything about Melville, Melville really, really regretted the fact that he got married. It's not to say he didn't love Elizabeth, his wife, but he sort of saw the bachelor's life as being the ideal for the artist. And because of that, he sort of regretted marriage. It was a very notoriously unhappy marriage. And Washington Irving was always sort of a happy bachelor. And the idea of the happy bachelor comes up in a lot of Washington Irving stories. In fact, I think it even comes up in Devil and Tom Walker. We'll talk about that. Whereas like, I'm not going to get remarried, no commitments. I can kind of live a life of freedom. And of course, how American is that? I can live a life of freedom as a bachelor. I don't have to be tied down to a family or a location or to a particular woman. I can just kind of, do as I please. And also, big for Washington Irving, it meant he didn't have to be a lawyer. He had promised his future father-in-law to be that he would take a job as a lawyer to be able to provide for Matilda Hoffman. And he no longer has to do this. He can kind of just live a literary life. And in fact, because of that, he becomes the first American author to make a living from his writing, which is not nothing. That is actually pretty significant. Good. Okay, so continuing forward, 1819, he's catapulted to international fame. International fame meaning he's just accepted by the British literary establishment with the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. Geoffrey Crayon, another one of his pseudonyms. We get a lot of famous stories in the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, including Rip Van Winkle, which we'll talk about, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which there'll be a lecture on both of those. 1824, he tries to replicate his success with Tales of a Traveler. The literary establishment doesn't like it, even though functionally it's just as good, if not, quite frankly, I would say better than the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. This is where we get today's tale, which is The Devil and Tom Walker. Again, it's not very successful, but it basically does the same thing. It's just a replication of what he had already done, if not a little better. Mentioned diplomatic service to Spain, and so this is really interesting in the context of U.S.-Spanish relations, or U.S. relations with the Hispanic world in the sense of Spanish speakers. That's something I'll definitely be talking a lot about as someone who's studied a lot of history of the Spanish-speaking world, Spanish literature, so on and so forth. That's a perennial topic of interest of mine. So he writes The Tales of the Alhambra, which is basically the sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon in Spain, and The Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus. And so if you ever wondered, like, where do we get all these myths? Like, why does the U.S. celebrate Columbus Day? We don't anymore. It's Indigenous Peoples' Day, is it not? But prior to that, when I was young, we celebrated Columbus Day. Okay, why do we celebrate Columbus Day? He's a Genovese sailor. He's a Genovese sailor who's working for the Spanish court of Ferdinand and Isabella. Why do we celebrate Columbus Day? Why is there, like, for example, in my home state of Ohio, the capital is Columbus. Why is there a city named after Christopher Columbus? What does he have to do with us? We in the U.S., at least in the 19th century, right, we're primarily Anglo. What do we have to do with Christopher Columbus? Well, the reason we become so interested in Christopher Columbus is because Washington Irving was interested in Christopher Columbus. And Washington Irving basically says, look, Columbus is American. He's like us. He was bold. He was defiant. He was innovative. He flouted conventions. He was a man like us. And so he portrays Christopher Columbus as not being, Genovese or Italian, even though, like, obviously he says he is, right? But he's not a prototypical Italian man. He's not a prototypical Spaniard. He's a prototypical Yankee. He's as American as apple pie. This is Washington Irving's thesis. And so the stories of, like, Columbus knew the earth was round even though everybody thought it was flat. Okay, no one actually ever thought that ever. But we get those stories, like all these myths and legends about Christopher Columbus, from that biography. Because again, Washington Irving effectively, at least on an unconscious level, realized every great culture needs myths and legends. America is a polity that is created out of whole cloth. We don't have any myths or legends. And so if we're going to get myths or legends, we have to write them ourselves. And so what Washington Irving does is effectively what the Brothers Grimm do for Germany, but for the United States. Okay, I am going to give us a national history. Instead of collecting it from the people, I am going to write it myself with my stories and with my biographies. Excuse me, losing my voice a little bit here. Good. Okay, he comes back to America in 1834, I believe. 1835, we get a tour of the prairies. He goes and visits the territories and writes about his experience there. We get a little bit of a quiet period. In 1849, interestingly enough, he writes a biography of Muhammad. Now, we're going to talk a lot about this because it intimately relates to the history of Mormonism and to a lot of other things that go on in the United States in the antebellum period. But there is an antebellum fascination with Egyptology, excuse me. That's where we get, like, Cairo, Illinois, right? We have Memphis, Tennessee. We have all these cities in the United States that are randomly named after Egyptian places. Where does that come from? There's a 19th century fascination with Egyptology that we can talk about. There's also a 19th century fascination with Arab Orientalism. So British studies of the Arab world. And there becomes a lot of popular interest in Muhammad for the first time. And so Washington Irving, our, like, literary forefather, writes a, quite frankly, I would say an interestingly sympathetic, at least for the time period, biography of Muhammad. And he's not the only, like, major European, obviously Washington Irving's not European, but part of the European tradition intellectual figure who has good things to say about Muhammad. We will also see something very similar with Goethe as well. Goethe has a lot of very positive things to say about Muhammad, and a lot of that comes out of the Enlightenment and Romantic tradition. We may take a look at that biography, actually. In any case, the swan song, the last major thing that he writes, is the five-volume biography of George Washington. He dies November 28th, 1859. So that's the biography of Washington Irving. If we have any questions about any of that, please feel free to leave those down in the comments. I'd be happy to clarify anything there. And as always, I love receiving comments, so definitely leave those. And we will now continue to the story that we're going to be dealing with for today, which is The Devil and Tom Walker, which appears in 1824, Tales of a Traveler, as I mentioned. And it appears in a section of the work that is dedicated to talking about the treasure of Captain Kidd, who we'll talk about in just a minute. But I want to start by reading the opening of the text, and we'll dive in with some of the analysis, some of the close reading. Let's begin. A few miles from Boston in Massachusetts, there is a deep inlet winding several miles into the interior of the country from Charles Bay and terminating in a thickly wooded swamp or morass. On one side of this inlet is a beautiful dark grove. On the opposite side of the land rises abruptly from the water's edge into a high ridge on which grow a few scattered oaks of great and immense size. Under one of these gigantic trees, according to old stories, there was a great amount of treasure buried by Kidd the pirate. So we get a folk tale. We get a legend, very typical of the Knickerbocker School. Let's show, no, America is not a new nation. America is a nation with history. We're not like in a weird Enlightenment experiment, the way that the Soviet Union was a weird communist experiment. No. We're actually like an ancient nation with history. And so we're going to go back to the time of Captain Kidd. This is the 1690s. The inlet allowed a facility to bring the money in a boat secretly and at night to the very foot of the hill. The elevation of the place permitted a good lookout to be kept that no one was at hand, while the remarkable trees formed good landmarks by which the place might easily be found again. The old stories add, moreover, that the devil presided at the hiding of the money and took it under his guardianship. So we get the supernatural, sort of the romantic elements here, the stuff that Jefferson wouldn't like. We're going to bring the devil in, and the devil is going to be a character here. What is the devil going to do? The devil is effectively going to act as a sort of magical figure in this story of a Faustian bargain. But the devil is present when Captain Kidd hides his treasure. Now, what is the link between Captain Kidd and the devil? There are different stories about this. The one that Irving mentions, and I think this one is kind of funny, is that in order to be like a successful pirate or privateer or whatever you want to call Captain Kidd, he made a deal with the devil that he was going to bury pages of the Bible to like kind of desecrate them ritually. And as long as he did that, the devil would be on his side. So apparently this is what happened according to Washington Irving. But there are other links as well that we could talk about a little bit later on. In any case, but as well known, he always does with buried treasure, particularly when it is ill-gotten, that he took the money under his guardianship. Be that as it may, Kidd never returned to recover his wealth, being shortly after seized at Boston and sent out to England, and there hanged for a pirate. So this gets to the story of Captain Kidd, which I will address in one moment. I'm just going to grab a glass of water, and then we will talk about Captain Kidd. All right, I am back. So what's the deal with Captain Kidd, and why do we get the mention of Captain Kidd? Well, there are some interesting links with things that are going to come up later in the story. First thing we need to keep in mind, he's a Scottish-born pirate who settles in New York City after it is taken over by the Dutch. Taken over from the Dutch. So he settles in New York City, and he's later commissioned by members of the Whig junto, the junto. If you don't know anything about the Whig junto, it is worth looking into. This is essentially a political organization of high-profile members of the Whig Party. What do the Whigs believe in vis-a-vis the Tories? They are, in English politics, the more radical members of the Enlightenment. Now, this is English Enlightenment, so it's happening a little bit earlier than what we talk about the American Enlightenment. But the Whigs basically believe in republicanism at the really extreme ends. On the lesser extreme ends, they're in favor of free trade, they're in favor of laissez-faire, they're in favor of the Enlightenment ideas. Whereas the Tories are much more conservative. The Tories are much more monarchical overall. They favor the powers of the monarch over against Parliament. They're skeptical of any sort of Republican tendency, and they are much less interested in free trade, and they're much more mercantilist in their economic approach to things. And this actually checks out into some American political thought, which is why I made this genealogy for you. So in England, the earliest political factions that we need to be aware of are the Puritans against the Cavaliers, or the Roundheads against the Cavaliers. You have the supporters of the Republican project of the period of the interregnum after the regicide of Charles I, the Roundheads are the Puritans. Their opponents are the Cavaliers, who of course want a restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, something which ultimately happens. The Restorationists, after we get the so-called glorious, the Glorious Revolution, yeah, so-called, we don't need to talk about that too much. We get the division into Whigs and Tories. The old line Puritans, by and large, become what are known as Whigs. And the old line Cavaliers, by and large, become what are known as Tories. Now, these political divisions make sense in the English context. Whigs in favor of Parliament, Tories more in favor of the monarchy. Whigs lean Republican, Tories tend to lean anti-Republican. Whigs in favor of radical enlightenment, free trade, laissez-faire. Tories much more skeptical of those ideas. Now, they're both broadly within a tradition of liberalism, like broadly construed, but the Whigs are the more like radical liberal end of that. The Tories are the more conservative end of that. These divisions are going to continue to play out on the American continent. When we talk about patriots and loyalists in the American Revolution, those were not the terms that were used by the generation that lived through the American Revolution. The terms that were used were Whigs and Tories. The supporters of Washington, the supporters of the Continental Congress were called Whigs, and the supporters of effectively maintaining the colonies as colonies and maintaining them as a part of the English Empire were Tories. Okay, they did not use the terms patriots or loyalists. Those are terms that primarily arise after the fact. They are Whigs and Tories. And this checks out too, because if you read a great book, highly recommend, take a look at a book called The Men Who Lost America. This shows up like really profoundly in that particular book, which is, to my mind, like the major recent history of the so-called loyalists, which is not something that is often talked about in the American context. When we look at that book, what you see is, like, look at a man like James Fox, a liberal politician back in England. All of the Whigs in England, like including Edmund Burke, they're in favor of the American Revolution. They're all in favor of the colonies separating from England, because it's not a patriots versus loyalists thing. It really is a Whigs versus Tories thing. And so by and large, the people who are more against the American Revolution are Tories, who tend to settle in the South, who tend to be more part of a genteel plantation culture, who tend to be high church rather than low church. So these are primarily Anglicans. Whereas the patriots tend to be New Englanders, they tend to be Congregationalists, and lo and behold, if we look at this genealogy going back to the Puritans, no surprise that this takes place in New England, because even if the revolutionary generation were not themselves Puritans, their ancestors were Puritans. And that is going to be very important for Hawthorne, because Hawthorne is going to say, like, there is an inextricable link between Puritanism and the American Revolution. That the revolutionary generation of Ben Franklin, of Sam Adams, of Hancock, all those guys, whether or not they're aware of it, they are operating under a Puritan system. And that's something I've talked a lot about in the Enlightenment lectures. You can go look at that if you're curious. Now, in the days of the early Republic, we have the Patriots, and we have like the members of the Radical Enlightenment, who are basically going to become Federalists and Anti-Federalists. It's like, okay, we have separated from England. There are no more Loyalists. They have all fled to Nova Scotia. What are we going to do now? We have people who are going, okay, no, we gotta walk things back, right? We say the Thermidorian reaction of the American Revolution. No, all this like radical Jeffersonian Enlightenment stuff, supporting the French Revolution. No, we gotta stop this. We need the American system. We need tariffs. We need conservative statist economics. We got to walk back the revolution. Well, those are the Federalists. And then you have the Anti-Federalists who are like, no, as much local and state autonomy as possible, no strong federal government, no standing army, no European-style statism, free trade, laissez-faire, Enlightenment ideology. And those are the Anti-Federalists, who will eventually become what we know as the Jeffersonian Democrats. Now, in the period of the antebellum, we get a similar division, Jeffersonian Democrats and the Federalists. The Federalists are going to become what we know as the Republican Party, which is the big state party in the 19th century. So I apologize if you're one of those Republicans who insist that like there wasn't a shift. There was a shift that happened during the period of civil rights. Everyone knows this. Okay, this is just standard American history. The Republican Party in the 19th century, the party of Abraham Lincoln, is the big state party. It is the party of large, strong, powerful federal government. Whereas the Jeffersonian Democrats, who later become the Jacksonian Democrats under Andrew Jackson, and later, in their most extreme iteration, they become the Locofocos, they are the radical party of the Enlightenment. They are in favor of little federal government, laissez-faire, as much free trade as possible, no tariffs, so on and so forth. Also, as we're going to see, they also tend to be the ones who are in favor of decentralized banking. No national bank, wildcat banks, A-OK by most of the members of the Jacksonian Democrats. So we'll get to that in a moment. But this is the genealogy, and this is just to say these divisions map onto each other. Like, by and large, the most radical anti-federalists and Jeffersonian Democrats are going to have their links, back with the Puritans, whereas the most conservative members of the American establishment, they are going to go back closer towards Cavaliers. Now, by the time we get to Democrats and Republicans, that changes a little bit because we get the north-south axis intensifying in a really strong degree. But this is the basic outline of the American political genealogy. And it's something worth knowing because why? Captain Kidd is commissioned, this goes back to the original point, Captain Kidd is commissioned by members of the Whig junto. Kidd's privateering mission is a Whig-funded enterprise. And in fact, there are many people who sort of support the Whig historiography on this who will say Captain Kidd was put to death only because of his Whig ties. The Tories just wanted to get rid of him and blame the Whigs. Now, we don't have to get into that too much, but this is to say Captain Kidd is coded in a really interesting way. What's going on here? Okay, he has to go hunt pirates and French ships in the Indian Ocean. So at the time, England is at war with France, so French ships are fair game for so-called privateering, and there are numerous pirates in the Indian Ocean who Captain Kidd is supposed to be able to take out. Now, they don't get the plunder that they were hoping for, and so the mission goes south, threats of mutiny, so on and so forth, and Captain Kidd ends up killing his gunner, William Moore, in a duel, which Captain Kidd will be tried for murder for William Moore. Now, Captain Kidd becomes sort of enemy number one back in England because he caught, between that and something else that he does with an Armenian ship that is neutral, kind of complicated situation, he becomes public enemy number one back in England. And so we have here, it's from Wikipedia, the 1698 Act of Grace, which offered a royal pardon to pirates in the Indian Ocean, specifically exempted Kidd from receiving a pardon in Kidd's case due to his association with prominent Whig statesmen. So when Captain Kidd comes back from this journey, he has actually a large amount of gold. Okay, he did find later success. He arrives in Boston in 1699. This is where we get the legend that he buried his treasure prior to entering Boston. He's arrested when he gets to Boston, and he's shipped to London 2 years later. He's executed. The famous story about Captain Kidd is that he's hung twice. Because he's hung the first time, his neck doesn't snap, and they have to hang him again. So he's the Captain Kidd the twice hung, sometimes called, and we get all those myths of buried treasure. Now, this is important because it's going to come up again later in the story. Captain Kidd's Whig ties. Captain Kidd's Whig ties. Because we have Whig, we have Captain Kidd, and we have the devil, kind of all linked together in the sort of semiotics of what's going on here. That's super important because take a look here. If we look at the Puritans, they become the Whigs. The Cavaliers become the Tories. Tories become the Loyalists. Whigs become the Patriots. Obviously, the Loyalist branch dies off, and we're left with Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Okay? The conservative anti-Enlightenment faction of the early Republic are the Federalists. Washington Irving is a member of that faction. Washington Irving's family, big supporters of the National Bank, big supporters of the American system, big supporters of tariffs, so on and so forth. They are Federalists. They're dyed-in-the-wool Federalists. Now think about that. The Whigs are the ones who are in favor of free trade, of uninhibited economic transactions, of essentially the laissez-faire radical Enlightenment system, Jeffersonian internationalism. Well, let's go back to that. That has its origins genealogically in the Whig system. Okay, so Captain Kidd is tied to this Whig system that is later going to spread and become the radical Enlightenment ideology to which Washington Irving objects. This is confusing. Leave a comment down below. I can definitely explain that a bit further. Good. Okay, so let's continue going forward here with the text. So we get about the year 1727. That is going to become important. Lock that in. So the text begins in 1727. It'll continue into the 1740s. About the year 1727, just at the time earthquakes were prevalent in New England and shook many tall sinners down upon their knees, there lived near this place a meager, miserly fellow of the name of Tom Walker. He had a wife as miserly as himself. They were so miserly that they even conspired to cheat each other. Whatever the woman could lay hands on, she hid away. A hen could not cackle, but she was on the alert to secure the new laid egg. Okay, so Tom Walker and his wife are miserly. They want to accumulate and hoard as many resources as they possibly can. So far, so good. Whatever the woman could lay her hands on, she laid away. Her husband was continually prying about to detect her secret hoards, and many and fierce were the conflicts that took place about what ought to have been common property. So they should have common property. They should be able to hold things in common. They are not able to. They're very avaricious for private property. Okay, wait, we might start. Are we making connections? Let's go for it. They lived in a forlorn-looking house that stood alone and had an air of starvation. A few straggling savin trees, emblems of sterility, grew near it. No smoke ever curled from its chimney. No traveler stopped at its door. A miserable horse, whose ribs were as articulate as the bars of a gridiron, stalked about a field, where a thin carpet of moss, scarcely covering the ragged beds of pudding stone, tantalized and balked his hunger. And sometimes he would lean his head over the fence, look piteously at the passer-by, and seem to petition deliverance from this land of famine. Okay, they're Bostonians. This story is a satire of Bostonians. It's a satire of New Englanders written by a New Yorker. Now, New York and New York City, we know, is eventually going to become an international cosmopolitan capital. But in the 1820s, that is not what New York is. In the 1820s, New York City and New York State are the interior of the country. They represent the telluric tendency within American thought. And federalism, it's conservative. Against what? The radical Enlightenment supporting Puritan descendants, the Whigs, and of course later the Anti-Federalists and later the Jeffersonian Democrats in New England. Okay? New England is the hotbed of Puritanism. And so what we're getting here, when you'll see, Tom Walker eventually becomes a Puritan, becomes very passionate about congregationalism, the Puritan theology. That becomes important. But this is a satire of New Englanders. What is the joke about New Englanders? They're greedy. They're avaricious. They are focused on material things. They want to accumulate as much for themselves as possible. They do not believe in common property. They believe in private property. Okay, let's continue forward and see what other associations we get between New England and Tom Walker and his wife. So we continue forward, and this is somewhat funny. This is more a commentary on Washington Irving than anything else. The house and its inmates had altogether a bad name. Tom's wife was a termagant, meaning like a loud, obnoxious woman who creates a henpecked husband. Fierce of temper, loud of tongue, and strong of arm. Her voice was often heard in wordy warfare with her husband, and his face sometimes showed signs that their conflicts were not confined to words. No one ventured, however, to interfere between them. The lonely wayfarer shrunk within himself at the horrid clamor and clapper clawing, eyed the den of discord askance, and hurried on his way rejoicing if a bachelor in his celibacy. So I love this thing about the lonely wayfarer. The lonely wayfarer walks by the house and sees, the conflicts, how loud they are, how the house doesn't look pleasant, how there's an atmosphere of famine and sterility, and goes, "Oh, thank you, God, I am a bachelor. Thank you, God, I do not have a wife." This is Washington Irving, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, saying, "Thank you, God, that I am a bachelor. Thank you, God, that I decided not to get married." Kind of funny. Anyway, continuing forward, some more serious analysis. So Tom Walker decides to go for a walk out in the swamps. He's out essentially in the woods, in the wilderness, the territory of the devil. Now, we get a really interesting description of setting here. Let's take a look at this. It was late in the dusk of evening when Tom Walker reached the old fort, and he paused there a while to rest himself. Anyone but he would have felt unwilling to linger in this lonely, melancholy place, for the common people had a bad opinion of it from the stories handed down from the time of the Indian Wars, when it was asserted that the savages held incantations here and made sacrifices to the evil spirit. So think about what we talked about with Wonders of the Invisible World. Cotton Mather says these are territories which were once the devil's. They belonged to the pagans. Well, who are the pagans? The Native Americans. Why? Well, as the book of Psalms says, all the gods of the pagans are demons. So the Puritans had a strong belief that the Native Americans in their indigenous religion were worshiping demons, were worshiping the devil. Just as, remember, they see themselves as, how do you want to say this? The Israelites who come into the promised land of Canaan after they escape from Egypt, after they escape from slavery in England. They come to the wilderness where they're going to build their shining Jerusalem, and they have to fight off the pagan tribes, just as the Israelites had to fight off all the pagan tribes that occupied the land of Canaan, that were making sacrifices to Baal, to Moloch, so on and so forth. Native American religions are understood the same way. Most Americans have some sort of sense that the Native American indigenous religions are demon worship. And so this gives us something distinctly American that we do not see in England, which is the Native Americans. The idea that Native Americans have a sort of wildness or untameness, that they worship demons. These are things that only occur in an American setting, and we're getting a distinct American setting and a distinct American flavor to this particular story. So what does Tom Walker do? He's in this place where there seems to be all of this history. Tom Walker, however, was not a man to be troubled with any fears of the kind. He reposed himself for some time on the trunk of a fallen hemlock, listening to the boding cry of the tree toad, and delving with his walking stack into a mound of black mold at his feet. As he turned up the soil unconsciously, his staff struck against something hard. He raked it out of the vegetable mold, and lo, a cloven skull with an Indian tomahawk buried deep in it lay before him. The rust on the weapon showed the time had elapsed since his death blow had been given. It was a dreary memento of the fierce struggle that had taken place in this last foothold of the Indian warriors. "Humph," said Tom Walker as he gave a kick to shake the dirt from it. So we see a cloven skull, presumably of one of the original settlers of Boston, and there's an Indian tomahawk buried in it. So we have this sort of interesting place where clearly, maybe it's King Philip's War, but there's some sort of conflict going on between the settlers and the Native Americans. It ends in bloodshed, and this also seems to be a place where the Native Americans would practice their indigenous religion and make some sort of demonic sacrifices. Now, of course, are these objectionable characterizations of the Native Americans? Yes, obviously. But what's going on here is something deeper. It's the construction of a uniquely American setting, and it's taking events in American history and making them a part of folklore. Again, very characteristic of the Knickerbocker School and its aesthetic. Now, what happens from here? We get the meeting with Old Scratch. Old Scratch is the name for the devil. And so Tom Walker meets the devil. They have a conversation. Tom Walker says to the devil, "I thought this was Deacon Peabody's woods." And they get into this conversation that we have here. "But what right have you," said Tom, "to cut down Deacon Peabody's timber?" "The right of a prior claim," said the other. "The woodland belonged to me long before one of your white-faced race put foot upon the soil." "And pray, who are you, if I may be so bold?" Said Tom, "Oh, I go by various names. I am the wild huntsman in some countries, the black miner in others. In this neighborhood, I am known by the name as the Black Woodsman." It's going to come up again in Hawthorne. "I am he to whom the red man consecrated this spot, and in honor of whom they now and then roasted a white man by way of sweet-smelling sacrifice." So sweet-smelling sacrifice, hopefully you know, that's a reference to the sweet-smelling sacrifices that are offered by the Israelites. The book of Psalms is full of references to sweet-smelling sacrifice, as are Leviticus, Deuteronomy, so on and so forth. And so here they're saying the Native Americans would offer colonial settlers up as sacrifices in their demonic religion, which the devil was present at. "Since the red men have been exterminated by you white savages." So notice this is quite interesting. Washington Irving, and this is pretty characteristic of the Knickerbocker School too. Yes, we get the associations of the Native Americans with all these sort of pagan, negative, demonic practices, but interestingly enough, we get the sense that, well, the white settlers were in their own way just as savage, which I think is quite interesting. "I amuse myself by presiding at the persecutions of Quakers and Anabaptists. I am the great patron and prompter of the slave dealers and the grand master of the Salem witch trials." So notice skepticism about the Puritan narrative here. Washington Irving is conveying Salem witch trials were show trials. They were not the real thing. They were not the real deal. What supports the slave trade? The devil. What supported the persecutions of the Quakers and the Anabaptists? It was the devil. It was the devil. And so we get Washington Irving's viewpoint here that the Puritans were involved in these persecutions, as well as the Puritans who brought the Salem witch trials to their fulfillment, were acting on behalf of the devil. So again, if we go back here, we have Captain Kidd's treasure associated with Whigs, associated with the devil. So those things are all put together because Captain Kidd's treasure is protected by the devil. Captain Kidd is well known to be a Whig-backed figure. Then later we get the Puritans, who again also have their associations with the Whigs. And the Puritans here are said to be working in the service of the devil. Okay? Tom Walker later is going to become a Puritan. Are we starting to get some sense of how Washington Irving is seeing things? Washington Irving is saying the radical Enlightenment thinkers, the Whig thinkers, the Puritans who live in New England, and all those who do not embody a more nationalistic, conservative, traditional, tellurically minded worldview are acting on behalf of the devil. This is quite interesting because this is a satire of New England from an outsider, from someone from New York. And of course, from someone who is a Federalist, who objects to all of these ideas and to their genealogies. If you have questions on that, put that in the comments. I get that that's a nuanced point, that's a subtle point, but that really is what is going on with this story. Because what we're going to see in later Washington Irving works is Washington Irving is capable of making a satire of New Yorkers, which he does in Rip Van Winkle. He's also capable of showing how those two worlds come together, because we see the convergence of the twain with Ichabod Crane, who is a standard prototypical Yankee. He's a standard New Englander. He comes in contact in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow with Brom Bones. And what's the deal with Brom Bones? Well, Brom Bones is representative of the conservative, of the earth, telluric force of the indigenous New Yorker. Indigenous in the sense of autochthonous. I grew up in New York rather than I grew up in a port. That satirical concern is something very important for Washington Irving. Both politically as a Federalist, but also in terms of just talking about American regional cultures and satirizing them and showing them to be things that are worthy of representation. Good. Okay, so they continue forward. The upshot of all of which is, if I mistake not, said Tom sturdily, you are commonly known as Old Scratch. The same at your service, replied the black man with a half-civil nod. Now, what ends up happening, of course, is that Tom Walker comes home, his wife sees the devil's mark on his forehead, and she's like, oh, you saw the devil, he offered you kid's treasure, you're not going to take it, you're an idiot, I'm going to go get kid's treasure. I'm going to go get it right now. So she goes out in the woods, she takes all the valuables from the home, and she offers them up to the devil. The devil doesn't seem to take her sacrifice. All that is left of Tom Walker's wife is her heart and her liver. Okay, so Tom Walker says, well, wife's already gone, I'm going to go make a deal with the devil. He goes to go make the Faustian bargain. He finds the devil, and we get the Faustian bargain. Let's take a look at this. By degrees, however, Tom brought him, meaning the devil, to business, and they began to haggle about the terms on which the former was to have the pirate's treasure. There was one condition which need not be mentioned, being generally understood in all cases where the devil grants favors. Tom Walker sold his soul. But there were others about which, though of less importance, he was inflexibly obstinate. He insisted that the money found through his means should be employed in his service. So what the devil tells Tom Walker is, look, I will give you Captain Kidd's treasure, which I have possession of. But you have to do something for me with that money. You have to put that money in my service. He proposed, therefore, that Tom should employ it in the black traffic. That is to say, that he should fit out a slave ship. So the devil's like, look, become a slave trader. Use the money, start a slave trading enterprise. So we get a sort of anti-slavery stance from Washington Irving. This, however, Tom resolutely refused. He was bad enough in all conscience, but the devil himself could not tempt him to turn a slave trader. Finding Tom so squeamish on this point, he did not insist upon it, but proposed instead that he should turn usurer. Well, what is usury? Usury is lending money at interest. So traditionally in the West, in Christendom, in both the Orthodox world and in the Catholic world, lending money at interest, regardless of what the interest rate was a mortal sin. You could not lend money at any rate of interest. Not 1% simple interest, not 0.00001% compound interest. All interest upon a loan was usurious. If you have questions about that, I have a video actually about that on my channel. You can go find that and go into more depth about that. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in relation to John Calvin. But we will put a pin in that for the moment. Instead, he should turn usurer, the devil being extremely anxious for the increase of usurers, looking upon them as his peculiar people. To this, no objections were made, for it was just to Tom's taste. So this is a classic sort of humorous satire of a New Englander. What's going on here? The devil says to Tom, be a slave trader. And Tom, being a New Englander, right, there's no slavery in New England, at least not after the initial years, right? But by the 18th century, no slavery in New England. He says, please, be a slave trader. And Tom says, no. No, he's sort of pearl clutching, right? Me, a slave trader? No, I will never trade slaves. And then the devil says, all right, we'll lend money at interest, which of course creates debt slavery. This was always one of the great objections of the South to the North, is that when Southerners defended the system of chattel slavery that they had, they'd say, yeah, okay, slavery, maybe not that good, but what do you have in the North? 8-year-old immigrant girls working 14 hours a day in sweatshops, rampant debt slavery, rampant wage slavery. How are you going to condemn us? And so Washington Irving, he's not making that exact Southern point, but he is being a little tongue-in-cheek that this New Englander, oh, me, slavery, no, I would never have anything to do with slavery. But he has no problem being a moneylender who is going to put people into debt slavery. And so for that reason, it's seen as a little bit humorous. Because, of course, people don't realize in this period, in both England and in the United States, if you did not pay your loan, your property would be seized. Standard. There was no bankruptcy. So there was no like, oh, I'm going to declare bankruptcy and everything's going to be fine. No bankruptcy. Okay, your property's seized and it doesn't cover the debt, doesn't cover the interest. Well, now it's illicit for them to like seize your family's property. They can seize, if your parents are still alive, they can seize your parents' property, they can seize your children's property, they can seize your brother's property, so on and so forth, to pay off the debt. And if the whole family does not have property that can be seized, they can seize you. They can seize your person. They can say you are going to essentially become an indentured servant until you pay off with your labor the cost of the loan, both in principal and in interest. This is what happens to Charles Dickens' father. And this was totally licit up through about the 1850s, which is kind of crazy to believe, but it's true. This is what was done in the Middle Ages, is that if you didn't pay your debts, they could literally take your labor as a means of paying off the debt and paying off, again, both principal and interest. So the link between like slavery, as it was practiced in the South, and debt slavery is being made here, and that is the joke. Now, is chattel slavery in the South the same thing as being in debt? No. However, the fact that your labor could be seized and essentially you could be forced to work to pay off the debt does make that linkage at least intelligible, even if it's not quite the same thing. Good. Okay, so you shall open a broker's shop, meaning like a pawn shop, in Boston next month, said the black man. I'll do it tomorrow if you wish, said Tom Walker. You shall lend money at 2% a month. Egad, I'll charge 4. So notice the devil initially says 2% per month, which is funny. That's like 30% rate of interest, APY, I believe, which is what I think most credit card companies are allowed to charge 30% or higher, up to 36%, I think in most states. So it's kind of funny. The devil's rate of interest pretty close to some modern rates of interest that we see. And Tom Walker says, egad, I will charge 4. So he is very happy to be doing this. Now, this is where we start to get something interesting. This is part of the satire on New Englanders that we see, is that Tom Walker is embedding himself in a discourse about Puritanism. Because what we're going to see in the later portion of the story is that Tom Walker becomes a Puritan. He becomes a member of a Congregationalist church. He wants to bring back the persecution of the Quakers and the Anabaptists. He becomes coded as Puritans. But something that you may miss as a modern reader is that the link between Puritans and usury, the link between Puritans and lending money at interest is really, really, really strong. Okay, why? Excuse me. Let's go back to the Protestant Reformation. So Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther. One of Martin Luther's major objections to the Catholic Church. He says, first, obviously, they're doing things that are unbiblical. He objects primarily to the scholastic method. He objects to the understanding of grace. He objects to the understanding of the sacraments. Right? There are a lot of major objections that Luther is making. But one of Luther's big objections that people often lose sight of is that the Catholic Church tolerated a type of contract known as the triple contract, which scholars still to this day debate whether or not the triple contract was usury or not. The Catholic Church, I don't think ever made an official ruling on the triple contract, but there were theologians who said triple contract licit, not usurious. And so one of Martin Luther's big objections was the Catholic Church is not doing enough to suppress usury. And there is some historical precedent for this being the case. The classic one is only 100 years earlier, actually not even 100 years earlier, only about 50 years earlier, you have the case of Savonarola, who Savonarola is basically, look, the Pope is a sodomite and everyone is tolerating usury. Like, this has to stop. We have to stop lending money at interest and we have to stop tolerating sodomy. This in Savonarola publicly preaches these things, and we have the Bonfire of the Vanities, where famously we get the why am I blanking on his name? Birth of Venus. Oh yeah, we get the destruction of Botticelli's paintings. We get the destruction of all what were seen as these superfluous Renaissance works of art that were sort of pagan revivalist in their orientation, and we get a walking back of the Renaissance under the popular preaching of Savonarola. But beyond the sort of, hey, the Renaissance has gone too far in its humanism and in its revival of the classics, one of Savonarola's big theses was, we have tolerated too much usury for too long. Savonarola, I think you know it doesn't end well for Savonarola. You can go look into that. But Martin Luther, one of his big objections was the Catholic Church is not doing enough about usury. And so if the Catholic Church is not going to do something about usury, I am going to do something about usury. And so the early Reformation was really, really, really anti-banking in its emphasis. Like very popular, very anti-money lending. Okay, what ends up happening? You get the strain of the Reformation that comes from John Calvin, what we call the Reformed tradition rather than the Lutheran tradition. And John Calvin is the first major Christian theologian in the world. This is East and West. And this is including all of the heretics. Because not like the Gnostics, the Albigensians, like even none of the heretics up to this point had supported lending money at interest. This is a new phenomenon. And John Calvin famously says, 1545 letter to Claude de Sachin, who is a famous Catholic, I don't know if he's a theologian. I think he is a theologian. But he's a famous Catholic thinker. And John Calvin writes a letter saying 5% simple interest per annum for the purposes of trade, meaning like I'm making a business loan, totally illicit. So again, this is not compound interest. This is not modern credit cards. But John Calvin is the first person to say, I'm going to eyeball it. And I'm going to say that's not usury. Calvin's the first person to say usury is excessive rate of interest on a loan, which is still how the modern law, like if you look at usury laws, it's about excessive rates of interests. And if you ask most modern Christians, Catholic, Orthodox, or otherwise, they say, oh, usury is just excessive rate of interest on a loan. No, it's not. Okay? You see what I did there? It's not. Go look at any of the texts of the Church Fathers. I can promise you, none of them say you can lend so much as a penny or ask for so much of a penny of interest on a loan. John Calvin's the first person to say otherwise. He says 5% simple interest per annum for trade, totally good, totally illicit. And just by the way, if you think about this for a moment, is it any great surprise that in the world that we live in, with the sort of ascendancy of the American empire, that most Christians sort of absorbing, we could say, from the atmosphere, atmospheric liberalism, atmospheric laissez-faire free trade, pro-market philosophies that just sort of they circulate in the psychosphere. They go, oh, you know, it's just, as long as it's not excessive, it's fine. That's not in the tradition. Go look at the Bible, go look at the Church Fathers. Anyway, Calvin says 5% simple interest per annum for trade, totally fine. Here's an exact quote. I do not consider that usury is wholly forbidden among us, except it be repugnant to justice and charity. And then later he writes a treatise, De Usuris. Why should the lender be cheated of his just due if the money profits the other man and he be the richer of the two? And then we get the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And of course, Massachusetts Bay is a colony founded by Puritans. And as you know from our unit on Puritans, the Puritans are the disciples of John Calvin. They're not Calvinists per se, but they respect John Calvin, and the Puritans would not exist were it not for Calvin's theologies. So let's look at what the Body of Liberties has to say. No man be adjudged to pay for detaining any debt from any creditor above £8 in the 100 for 1 year, and not above that rate proportional for all sums whatsoever, neither shall this be a color or countenance to allow usury among us contrary to the law of God. So here they say, look, £8 per 100 in 1 year. So 8% simple interest per year is the rate at which it's not usury in Massachusetts. If you charge 9% simple interest, it's usury in Massachusetts. But here they go above and beyond Calvin. They say 8% simple interest, totally fine. This coding was well known in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. So for example, Shakespeare. Joseph Peirce, the very famous Catholic literary critic, writes an article, Shakespeare versus the Puritans, where he says, look, Merchant of Venice, everyone thinks this play is about Jewish moneylenders. And he says, Shylock, yes, in the context of the play, is a Jewish character. But Shylock, as he would have been understood by Shakespeare's audience, was understood as a Puritan. And if you go through the argument, I think it's actually a really convincing argument that Shylock was meant to be understood as a Puritan. And Shakespeare would have known Puritan moneylenders intimately. Why? One of the major theaters in London was Blackfriars. And Blackfriars was in kind of an outside neighborhood that was a neighborhood of radical Puritans. Because remember, Puritans are kind of on the periphery. They're kind of radical. They're kind of extreme. They're kind of like, you know, like Marxists in the 20th century. They're radical. They're intelligent. They're young. They've got this sort of whatever. And so they're living on the margins in this kind of crappy neighborhood called Blackfriars. And there's a major theater in Blackfriars, okay? And so Shakespeare, intimately involved with the world of theater, would have seen the Puritan moneylending that went on in Blackfriars and thought, oh, interesting. And everyone who, like in London, would have known moneylending and Puritans were like peanut butter and jelly. And so Shylock really was not meant to be a parody or a stereotype or a pastiche of Jewish characters, though obviously there are things about Shylock that are very obviously coded Jewish. Shakespeare probably never saw a Jew in his entire life. Remember, Jews were still expelled from England in the period in which Shakespeare was alive. They will not be brought back into England until Oliver Cromwell. And so the coding here is Shylock is representative of Puritans, because Puritans and moneylending are like peanut butter and jelly. Okay, well, lo and behold, is it an accident that Tom Walker becomes both a Puritan in the text, he adopts the Puritan theology, but he also becomes a moneylender? No, because what Washington Irving is doing here is satirizing those tendencies and saying New England is the place of free market Whigs who are in favor of piracy, who are in favor of speculative land bubbles, who are in favor of usury and moneylending, and who are in favor of a life that is geared around commerce and nothing but commerce. And that's why we see all these links put together, okay? Because let's see what happens here. This is quite interesting. And this kind of ties everything together. So Tom Walker starts to make some money. And what happens? We get this quote from the text. His reputation for a ready-moneyed man who would lend money out for a good consideration soon spread abroad. Everybody remembers the time of Governor Belcher. Okay, Governor Belcher, hated by the Puritans. He's one of the royal governors. Him and Thomas Hutchinson are the two most hated royal governors by the Puritans in the 18th century. So keep that in mind. Everybody remembers the time of Governor Belcher when money was particularly scarce. It was a time of paper credit. The country had been deluged with government bills. The famous land bank had been established. Keep that land bank in mind. That's going to come up again later. There had been a rage for speculating. The people had run mad with schemes for new settlements, for building cities in the wilderness. Land jobbers went about with maps of grants and townships and Eldorados, lying nobody knew where, but which everybody was ready to purchase. In a word, the great speculating fever, which breaks out every now and then in the country, had raged to an alarming degree, and everybody was dreaming of making sudden fortunes from nothing. As usual, the fever had subsided, the dream had gone off, and the imaginary fortunes with it. The patients were left in doleful plight, and the whole country resounded with the consequent cry of hard times. Okay, now we get the last little bit of historical context that's going to tie everything together. What is the land bank that's being referred to in the time of Governor Belcher? Okay, this is the land bank of 1740. So, a number of New Englanders in Massachusetts get together to respond to a scarcity of currency. There's a scarcity, particularly of specie, of gold and silver, beginning in 1727, right? Let's read this. Why does the story begin in 1727? In 1727, the General Court recognized the scarcity of money by allowing the province tax in Massachusetts to be paid in commodities and manufactured goods at specified prices. So you could pay with your goods or your crops instead of paying with gold and silver, which were scarce. Continuing forward. The collectors of the tax were instructed by the town to receive the sums assessed upon the freeholders and inhabitants, and payment could be made in wheat, rye, barley, oats, Indian corn, fish, beef and pork, flax and hemp, butter, beeswax, bayberry wax, and many other products, all of which species shall be of the growth, produce, and manufactures of this province. That's from the famous historian of Ipswich, Thomas Franklin Waters. Okay? Now, the land bank comes into being to respond to this crisis, to help out the common man. And so the land bank says, look, we are going to give you these paper notes. We're going to give you paper currency. And what is that currency going to be backed by? Why is that currency going to have value? We are going to back it with a mortgage on your property. So we are going to back that with the returns that your property, like your farm, is going to generate. And so we will give you ready money. We'll give you these paper currencies in return for you mortgaging out your property to us. And so all of a sudden, there's this flood of paper money that you can use to pay taxes with, that you can use to pay merchants. And the common man's like, this is great. I have all this paper money. Okay? The problem is it ends up creating an enormous speculative bubble because this paper money is being issued. It's kind of on shoddy backing. It's on the basis of future gains that may or may not exist. And it's totally unregulated. The government, in this case Parliament, had not stepped in to say, hey, you can't just create a currency out of thin air and say that these pieces of paper have value because they're backed by something, that's a security and we need to be involved in that. We should be dealing in silver and gold in currency and not like these fraudulent paper notes. And so what ends up happening is that, let me read this. So let me read this first. So this is from Thomas Franklin Waters in his Historian of Ipswich. This is from his History of Ipswich. He reads as follows. The merchants of New England petitioned Parliament to forbid the continuance of the land bank. Governor Belcher threatened to remove supporters of the bank from office. Justices of the Peace, who had been commissioned by the governor, did not wait removal. They sent him their resignations. Okay, so Governor Belcher gets words of what's going on, and he goes, this is ridiculous. You have to make payments in gold and silver. We cannot accept payments in this fraudulent paper currency that's backed by the promise of future returns. This is hogwash. Give me real money. And so Governor Belcher sticks his foot down in favor of hard money rather than in paper currency. This upsets, of course, the supporters of the land bank, who, as we mentioned before, are like common men. They're people who own farms and they just wanted to be able to get a hold of ready money. They sent him their resignations. John Choate was one of the first to resign, along with Samuel Adams. Sam Adams, wait a minute, I've heard that name before. Yeah, the Sam Adams of the Revolutionary generation, his father lost his shirt in this whole land bank business. Do you think that made the young Sam Adams hate the royal government? You bet it did. It's like, why did Sam Adams have such a chip on his shoulder about the royal government? Well, the reason why is because his father lost basically everything he had in this stupid land bank thing. And instead of going, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have issued a speculative paper currency and said it had value and not petition Parliament to recognize it and just sort of pass it off fraudulently, maybe that was irresponsible. Sam Adams, both senior and younger, went, no, this is the fault of the royal government. They shouldn't have gotten involved in our affair. Laissez-faire. If we want to make a fake paper currency, let us do as we please. If you think about this long enough, you may notice the parallels between this and the whole cryptocurrency nonsense, rug pulls, NFTs, so on and so forth. Anyway, Sam Adams. Major Ami Ruma Wise of Ipswich, who also held the commission of Justice of the Peace with several others, was removed from his office on January 1st, 1741 for receiving and passing the notes of the land bank and persisting therein. So they remove him from office because it's like, you can't keep circulating this fake paper currency. It's not real. Anyway, the registers of deeds, because I want you to imagine, it's like, imagine I issue a cryptocurrency and I say this cryptocurrency is backed by like the future value of your house or the future returns that your land is going to generate. And we're in a situation where the US government is not paying attention and I can just pay my taxes in this, right? And I start paying like other local people and convincing them to accept it. And so now like all the local merchants are accepting this, my cryptocurrency, my NFT, and the federal government is accepting it to pay my taxes. And so I've swindled everyone with this cryptocurrency that's actually worth, who knows, right? It's worth nothing. It's worth future returns, whatever those may be. And I now have this swindle. Well, that's what's going on here, is that government officials were accepting this currency as legitimate, as were merchants, and everyone's trying to pass off, like, no, this piece of paper has value. And Governor Belcher is having none of it. He's like, this does not have value. And this letting this continue unregulated is going to lead to a disaster. Hard money only. Anyway. The registers of deeds were commanded to send in the names of all who had mortgaged their property, meaning all those who had become a part of the land bank. A proclamation was issued by the governor forbidding all persons holding commissions in the militia to have any hand in this scheme for defrauding the people. And on December 11th, orders were issued to Colonel Barry and the other commanding officers to investigate their subordinates and discharge all involved. Well, how does this end? An act of parliament declared all the transactions of the two banks' schemes illegal and void. That's the so-called Bubble Act. And ordered that they should be entirely abandoned on or before September 29th, 1741, under penalty of treble damages. So Parliament steps in and says, you can't do this, okay? Parliament says, we're sorry, we don't want to get involved in colonial affairs, but you cannot pay your taxes and pass off as legal tender a fake currency from a fake land bank that you generated. This goes against like all common sense. This parliamentary interference, as it was regarded by the Friends of the Land Bank, was bitterly resented, and there were signs of a violent uprising in several towns. Yeah, and going back earlier, as many 5,000 land bank supporters were reported to have marched in Boston in a populist revolution against the merchants and royal government's stranglehold on the economy. There are people who said if Governor Belcher was not removed from office, this would have been the American Revolution. I'll read that again. There are people who say if Governor Belcher was not removed from office, this would have been the American Revolution. That's how seriously people took this land bank thing. And what you're going to see is Thomas Hutchinson, in his strictures on the Declaration, which we looked at earlier, he mentions this. And I'm going to show that in a moment. But this land bank thing was serious business. And of course, as I mentioned, the young Sam Adams cut his teeth in this whole thing. He saw what happened and had that resentment against the royal government precisely because they shut this whole thing down. So we can see already we have the imposition of the colonial government on the colonies being perceived in a negative way because of this paper money controversy. Now, should be noted, did King George II, was he the one who said, no, you can't do this? It was Parliament. Oh, it was Parliament. Okay, so is Parliament the bad guy or is the monarchy the bad guy? Well, the so-called patriots can't really make up their mind. But anyway, had Governor Belcher remained in power, it is possible and even probable that the first collision with Great Britain would have occurred at this time. Yes. Happily, his successor, Governor Shirley, appreciated the extreme delicacy of the situation. He found that the land bank party, which was very numerous throughout the province, irritated and inflamed to such a degree that they seemed ripe for tumult and disorder. Okay, we'll stop there. So going back, this land bank controversy is what is being referred to here. The story takes place in 1727 when the shortage of paper currency, when the shortage of specie, hard currency begins. We are now moving forward in time. So this is in the 1730s and 1740s, and we get the explosion of the land bank bubble. And so it's a time of paper credit. The country had been deluged with government bills. The famous land bank had been established. There was a rage for speculating, okay? And so when the fever subsides, when the bubble bursts, the dream had gone off and the imaginary fortunes with it. The patients were left in doleful plight, and the whole country resounded with this consequent cry of hard times. So this bubble bursts, and now everybody needs money. And so when you need ready money and you can't get ready money by inventing a paper currency or an NFT or a fake crypto coin, what are you going to do? You're going to go to the moneylender and you're going to say, can you give me money? And so this is how Tom Walker starts his business, is that because of the destruction of the land bank, there are people who need money and need money quick. And Tom Walker, who now has access to the treasure of the famous Whig Captain Kidd, can now lend out this money at interest. Now, two more things worth looking at. One, the line from Thomas Hutchinson that I mentioned earlier. So what's the deal with Massachusetts and paper money? We get that line from the Declaration. He had refused his assent, he being, of course, George III, he had refused his assent to the laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. And so what does Hutchinson say about this? The first in order is of so general a nature that it is not possible to conjecture to what laws or to what colonies it refers. I remember no laws which any colony had been restrained from passing, so as to cause any complaint of grievance except those for issuing a fraudulent paper currency and making it a legal tender. And so then he goes on to mention this is Parliament that did this, not the king, so why are they even complaining about it? But yeah, Hutchinson was one of the major opponents of this whole thing. Hutchinson was like, no, hard currency, silver. You got to deal in silver. You can't just issue a fraudulent currency. Because believe it or not, something similar happened again in the 1750s, and Hutchinson had to be the one to deal with it. So this is a recurring thing going on in Massachusetts, and we see it being referenced in the text as the exigence for all the demand for Tom Walker's money lending. Last thing, this happens again in 1819. This never stops happening in American history, okay? We have the Panic of 1819. If you know your American history, you took APUSH, you took an American history course in college, you're going to know what I'm talking about. After the War of 1812, there's another economic crisis where there's essentially a shortage of species and there's a need for ready money. We don't have gold, we don't have silver. What are we going to do? We'll enter the unrestrained wildcat banks who say, oh, I'll securitize anything and I'll issue paper money for it. These are actually from those said wildcat banks, okay? And broadly speaking, the Jeffersonian Democrats, the quote-unquote populists, they're in favor of the wildcat banks. They're like, yeah, sure, let them lend money, free market, laissez-faire, don't intervene in the economy, so on and so forth. Where the Federalists are like, we cannot have a national currency, and we cannot run a national economy, and we cannot develop economically if we're just allowing people to issue paper currencies that are securitized and backed by who knows what. This is just going to lead to chaos. We need to centralize things, and we need to regulate the economy so that people can't just create banks and currencies willy-nilly. Currency is a national affair. And of course, the more radical Enlightenment parties disagree with this because it goes against the whole idea of laissez-faire, free market. You should be able to do as you please. The government should intervene in your own life. You want to generate a currency. Who is the government to tell you you can't generate a currency? This is the context, because what ends up happening is, lo and behold, those banks are backed by absolutely nothing. All of them collapse. People lose their shirts, and we get the Panic of 1819. And during the Panic of 1819, as well as in the aftermath of the War of 1812, I mentioned this, Irving's family goes bankrupt. And so Irving, at least the Irving family business goes bankrupt. And so Irving knew intimately that this financial crisis was something that hurt him and that could have been prevented by implementing Federalist principles, like the American system, like tariffs, like the National Bank. A more statist view of American politics. And so what is Irving doing? He's looking back on this whole thing and saying, the problem is the root of all of this. The problem is the Puritans. The problem is the Puritans and their political philosophy. Because in Puritanism is the seed of the Enlightenment and laissez-faire, as I said in the earlier part of this course. And so Irving, the Federalist, is objecting to the Puritans, is objecting to the Whigs. Now, Patriots, maybe not. But he's objecting to the Puritans, he's objecting to the Whigs, and he's most certainly objecting to the Anti-Federalists, the Jeffersonian Democrats, and who will eventually become the Jacksonian Democrats. He's basically saying this unrestrained laissez-faire Enlightenment system of do as you please has its roots in Puritanism. All of this has its roots in Puritanism. And from Captain Kidd being supported by the Whigs, down to Tom Walker becoming a Puritan, and Tom Walker, making money doing the most Puritan thing possible, which is lending money. All of the, New England is the root of the problem. New England is the root of the problem. This is what is being satirized here. If you have questions on that, put that down in the comments. But hopefully I've made my point, okay? This is a satire on New England. This is a satire on the stereotypical New Englander. Good, okay, so now we get the last couple paragraphs of the story here. As Tom waxed old, however, he grew thoughtful. Having secured the good things of this world by means of the devil, he began to feel anxious about those of the next. He thought with regret on the bargain he had made with his black friend, and set his wits to work to cheat him out of the conditions. So he's going to try to cheat the devil. He became, therefore, all of a sudden, a violent churchgoer. He prayed loudly and strenuously, as if heaven were to be taken by force of lungs. Indeed, one might always tell when he had sinned most during the week by the clamor of his Sunday devotion. The quiet Christians who had been modestly and steadfastly traveling Zionward were struck with self-reproach at seeing themselves so suddenly outstripped in their career by this new-made convert. Tom was as rigid in religious as in money matters. So notice, money matters, religious matters. They're linked together. Puritanism and this particular view of the economy are linked together. This is interesting. He was a stern supervisor and censurer of his neighbors, and seemed to think every sin entered up to their account became a credit on his own side of the page. So he's thinking about his sins and the sins of others, like double entry bookkeeping, right? He's thinking about them in economic terms. What have I mentioned? Puritanism, covenant theology. They see God in terms of contracts. They see God in terms of the market. And is it any surprise that their descendants become the most radical members of the Enlightenment, become the most radical, practitioners of the free market system, and become those who sincerely believe in their heart of hearts that laissez-faire and non-intervention in the market and creating a system of government by contract is going to lead to a utopia, is going to bring us to Zion. I don't think that's an accident. Anyway, he even talked about the expediency of reviving the persecutions of the Quakers and the Anabaptists. In a word, Tom's zeal became as notorious as his riches. Still, in spite of all this strenuous attention to forms, Tom had a lurking dread of that the devil, after all, would have his due. That he might not be taken unawares, therefore, it is said he always carried a small Bible in his coat pocket. He also had a great folio Bible on his counting house desk and would frequently be found reading it when people called on business. So he has this big Bible, and he's hoped, when the devil comes to get me, I'll be reading the Bible, and he won't be able to take me. Continuing forward, on such occasions, he would lay his green spectacles in the book to mark the place while he turned round to drive some usurious bargain. Now, the climax. One hot summer afternoon in the dog days, the canicula, right? Why is it called the dog days? It's because Sirius is in ascendancy. That's what we're in right now. It is very hot where I am. We're in the dog days. Sirius is in ascendancy. One hot summer afternoon in the dog days, just as the terrible black thunder gust was coming up, Tom sat in his counting house in his white linen cap and India silk morning gown. He was on the point of foreclosing a mortgage by which he would complete the ruin of an unlucky land speculator for whom he had professed the greatest friendship. The poor land jobber begged him to grant a few months' indulgence. Tom had grown testy and irritated and refused another day. "My family will be ruined and brought upon the parish," said the land jobber. "Charity begins at home," replied Tom. "I must take care of myself in these hard times." "You have made so much money out of me," said the speculator. Tom lost his patience and his piety. "The devil take me," said he, "if I have made 1 farthing. Well, we all know what's going to happen. Just then there were 3 loud knocks at the street door. He stepped out to see who was there, a black man who was holding a white horse, which neighed and stamped with impatience. "Tom, you're come forward," said the black fellow gruffly. Tom shrank back, but too late. He had left his little Bible at the bottom of his coat pocket and his big Bible on the desk buried under the mortgage he was about to foreclose. Okay, so that's very symbolic. Tom is now a Puritan. He's a Puritan moneylender in the tradition of John Calvin. John Calvin, Puritan theologian or proto-Puritan theologian, Reformed theologian who allows for lending of money at interest. Lo and behold, Tom Walker takes the most Puritan profession possible, which is lending money at interest. The Bible is here, the mortgage is on top. What is the claim that's being made about the Puritans? The Bible is less important than the economic system. And lo and behold, all the children of the Puritans adopt the economic and political philosophy in a secular way, but leave the religion behind. Think Ben Franklin and what we said about Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin takes the Puritan theology and secularizes it. Well, what do we see here? The theology is here, the mortgage is on top. What is really important for people in Massachusetts? Is it the religion? No. It's the Whig philosophy. It's the economic system. It's making money. This is the satire on people from New England. It all comes down to money. Think for a moment. You haven't read it, worth reading. Max Weber's famous sociological treatise, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. That's all about this. What Max Weber basically says is this idea of the Protestant work ethic, of working hard, of thrift, of industry, of making a lot of money, and having a lot of money being a sign of God's grace and favor, he says, goes back to Calvin. And he says Ben Franklin is the perfect embodiment of this system. Is it secularized? Yes. But it ultimately comes back to Protestantism and to the social and political changes that emerge with the Protestant Reformation. And I think we see this here. The Bible, but the social and the economic on top. In any case, and also mortgage. Look at this etymologically. Where does mortgage come from? From the Middle English, this is Wiktionary, best dictionary in the world. From Middle English, mortgage. From Anglo-Norman mortgage. From Old French, mortgage, which is a translation of judicial medieval Latin, mortem vadium, meaning death wager or death pledge. So a mortgage is a death pledge, okay? Meaning it only goes away if you die, essentially, or if it dies when it's amortized. What does amortized mean? Amortization is like an amortization schedule on a loan is just the payoff schedule. But amortization etymologically means to kill off the loan. You kill off the loan by making payments on it. But in any case, interesting that we get this here because the mortgage is also ironic because Tom Walker has mortgaged his own soul. He has mortgaged his own soul. He has made a death bond with the devil. He's now going to die. He's now going to forfeit his own soul. Tom, you're come for. The black man whisked him like a child into the saddle, gave the horse the lash, and away he galloped with Tom on his back in the midst of the thunderstorm. The clerks stuck their pens behind their ears and stared after him from the windows. Away went Tom Walker, dashing down the street, his white cap bobbing up and down, his morning gown fluttering in the wind, and his steed striking fire out of the pavement at every bound. When the clerks turned to look for the black man, he had disappeared. Last line. The good people of Boston shook their heads and shrugged their shoulders, but had been so much accustomed to witches and goblins and tricks of the devil in all kinds of shapes from the first settlement of the colony that they were not so much horror-struck as might have been expected. Trustees were appointed to take charge of Tom's effects, but there was nothing. Okay, what remains of Tom's fortune? Nothing. Think about this for a moment. What remains of Tom's fortune? Nothing. On searching his coffers, all his bonds and mortgages were found reduced to cinders. In place of gold and silver, his iron chest was filled with chips and shavings. 2 skeletons lay in his stable instead of his half-starved horses, and the very next day his great house took fire and was burnt to the ground. This is like a land bubble. What happened when the bubble of 1819 burst? You get the panic. And what happens? Oh, all this paper currency that's worth something, it's now worth nothing. Overnight, the paper currency is worthless. Overnight, your NFT, your cryptocurrency pump and dump is worthless. This is what Washington Irving is making fun of, is that these people, Puritans, Whigs, Anti-Federalists, Jeffersonian Democrats, from the people who supported the Wildcat banks in the early period of the 19th century, going all the way back to the people who founded the stupid land bank in 1740, they all have this laissez-faire philosophy that enables paper currency to be unregulated and to be backed by whatever, and fools buy into it. And what always ends up happening if these paper currencies are not regulated? The bubble bursts and everything is worth nothing. This is quite an interesting thing. Now, of course, on the sort of folklore level, what is being said is that his treasure was given to him by the devil took his soul, the treasure's gone because the mortgage has been fulfilled. Tom gave his soul has been collected, treasure is now gone. But there is an interesting commentary on, again, that whole Whig New England system at play here. Final lines. Such was the end of Tom Walker and his ill-gotten wealth. Let all griping money brokers lay this story to heart. The truth is not to be doubted. The very hole under the oak trees whence he dug kids' money is to be seen to this day, and the neighboring swamp and old Indian fort are often haunted in stormy nights by a figure on horseback in morning gown and white cap, which is doubtless the troubled spirit of the usurer. In fact, the story has revolved itself into a proverb, and is the origin of that popular saying so prevalent throughout New England of the devil and Tom Walker. Now, is this an actual proverb? No. But it's a funny little conclusion to the story, which basically says, hey, we have this phrase here in America called the devil and Tom Walker. It's a leopard, how the leopard got its spot story. Here's how we got this phrase. Very focused in the American setting, very focused in American folklore, very focused on making satirizations of American regions and American characters. I would say this 1824 text of Washington Irving's is the perfect genealogy of the Puritan economic view, but also the perfect satire on the Boston Yankee, on the Puritan as being someone who is more interested in money than they are in piety. Very interesting little text. We covered a ton of ground here. So if you are confused about anything, if you have questions about anything, if you have a comment you would like to leave, please leave one. I love reading those. I love answering your questions. I hope you guys found this helpful. As always, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you're interested, by the way, check out the description. I have a program on how to graduate college in 2 years, which, as many of you know, is something that I did. If that is something that interests you, go take a look at that. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you all in the next lecture. Take care.